Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have Steve McGinnis with us. He has been working in the technology space for a very long time now and has been studying SSI for the last couple of years. And Steve and we talked, and he said, hey, I think I could do a really great overview for CIOs, and that's something I think we're really missing. We were just before the session, we were talking about this and saying that the technology set or stack today is really mature enough to give an overview for CIOs, because a lot of times we go like in a very deep detail where we talk about exotic cryptography, or sometimes things just get very commercial. So yeah, today we try to find a middle ground here for so we do this experiment to do a CIO brief. I think we'll do more of these in the future as things mature in the SSI space, and really excited to have Steve with us and looking forward to listen to him and to what he has to share with us. If we go quickly to the next slide, and the second slide, we will see what SSI Meetup is about for the people that are joining us here today for the first time. Basically, SSI Meetup was created 2 years ago to empower global SSI communities, and this is open to everyone, to companies, to individuals, to associations, whatever you want. And basically, we share all this information with the Creative Commons by share-alike license, which means you can reuse this material in whatever way you want. You will see that the material will get published with the video, the slide share, and the Google slide deck that you can download and that you can reuse in your organization or in any other context. The only thing you have to do is to give credit back to SSI Meetup and to the person presenting, which today is Steve. And yeah, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the question tool that you can use anytime to bring up your questions. I'll manage those questions and I'll bring them up real time at the end of the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, we will have some more questions that you might be interested in. We will be adding today, we tried it already in the past, also a section about books. So Steve will be sharing with us the books that inspired him the most to learn about identity or to think about identity. And yeah, I think that summarizes everything. And Steve, thank you so much for being with us today here.
All right, thanks a lot, Alex. So 27 years ago, more or less, Peter Steiner published that little cartoon in the New Yorker. It's the now famous cartoon showing the dog in front of a computer. Dog uttered 8 prophetic words that really illuminated a design gap in the internet that within the next 10 years opened up the door to fraudulent activity, personal slander, erosion of social touchstones at a scale that no one could ever have imagined. So today, the impact of that design gap is forcing enterprises and government organizations to constantly struggle with a host of online issues, including fraud, trust with their customers and partners, sales friction, and suboptimal user experiences. So all big, important stuff. But any organization that are kind of dealing with these issues, and frankly, that's probably most of them out there, self-sovereign identity needs to be on the radar. It's really important. So the question is, how does self-sovereign identity help in this space? So the internet was really designed to connect computers through digital endpoints, and does a really good job with that. And it's been working pretty well for a long time. The problem is computers don't really care if the user behind them is someone that pretends to be someone that they're not. They don't argue, and it doesn't argue if we ask the computers to do something dishonest. In kind of the real world, when we try to identify who it is we're dealing with, whether it's even in person or even online, you go through a very complex chain of documents and interactions, and this is a diagram kind of illustrating it. And a couple important things about this is that literally we start to build our identity from birth. We're in the hospital and our parents, and together we get a birth certificate, and then from there we get a social security number and maybe a bank account and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is in the modern society, we start to have this concept of documentation about the real me as well as the online me. So at some point in my life, I create a Gmail account or a Facebook account and so forth. And lo and behold, when I go to get, say, a driver's license or a credit card or a car loan, they start asking me for that information about my digital self as well as my real self. And I think this is something that is fairly recent that has come about, and I think is very very telling. So you kind of have a you and a digital you, and the way we typically link those together is by a number of different things. We have kind of the proof of knowledge, so username and password. I know something, and that allows me to get access. We have proof of possession, things like I present a cryptographic key, or I present my social security card or birth certificate. Proof of biology, which I think is really fascinating emerging area, like biometrics. Self-attestation. Sometimes connecting you and digital you is nothing more than you saying, this is who I am. When you go to create an email account, you don't have to prove what your name is, you just create it and they say, fine. And you also have trusted authorities. So think of like Equifaxes out there that gather all this information. And in reality, when we connect the you and the digital you, we usually use lots of combinations of these things. So, you know, basically knowing who sits behind the screen is a hard problem to solve. And one of the, actually had a really, really interesting conversation just last week about this concept of, you know, what is an identity really? And we started talking about this notion of kind of expanding the concept of a Turing test and to include identity and trust. And the idea there is if you've got sort of the proverbial screen between you and the other party, and over time you interact with this party, you know, maybe you have conversations and perhaps at some point, you know, you sell something to them or they sell something to you, or you ask them to do a favor for you or whatnot. Over time, you start building a trust with this identity behind the screen. And, you know, maybe it goes over years and every time you interact with this identity behind the screen, things turn out the way you want them to. You don't have any bad experiences. And so your trust increases and builds. Now, the interesting thing about that is that you don't know what's behind the screen. You know, it could be your best friend, it could be a person, it could be a really awful individual who has, you know, horrible trust relationships with somebody else. But in this and this is effectively what's happening, you know, online is we have our digital representation that tends to be well known. And then we have the human or the person behind that is not well known. So it's a bit of a challenge. So the two really exciting technologies that are emerging, and I imagine that pretty much everyone on this call is very well versed in, as the decentralized identity and verifiable credentials. To me, this is really a powerhouse combination that starts to address this issue of who's behind the screen. I kind of broke this down for people who may not be familiar with the terms to sort of set the context for this conversation. And so I'm going to have a couple of these slides throughout the presentation that pops out some important terms. So the first three important terms are digital identity, decentralized identifiers, and verifiable credentials. When we talk about digital identity, we really sort of talk about it as a simple proxy for anything that exists in the real world. So it doesn't have to be biological, it doesn't have to be a person. You can think of a digital identity representing intellectual property, for example, or corporation, but it's something that exists in the real world. And in practice, it usually is a compact way to represent the uniqueness of those identities. So we have maybe an ID that represents a person, and that person really represents an entire life of interactions and information and documentation and so forth. So it's a quick way of doing that. Decentralized identifiers are the new type of identifier that allow you to, or we'll get into the details of what it allows you to do, but it's that in addition to the verifiable credentials, which is a way of making statements about yourself or having others make statements about you that then others can verify and get some sort of sense of whether or not you as an individual are making a trusted statement. And this will make a little more sense in a bit. So getting into a little bit of the weeds here, if we unknit kind of a decentralized ID, you see sort of what really is a decentralized identifier. And it really is a couple different pieces. There's what we call a DID, and there's what we call a DID doc. The DID doc is something that is put out on a decentralized network. And you know, in practice, this could be a public network, it could be a consortium network, but it's something where everybody who participates in it has access to these documents. And the document itself contains some information. It contains a public key, it contains what we call a service endpoint. And what happens is you have this real person here on the left with the key in their hand. And they have possession of a secret key that corresponds to the public key in this DID document that's out there on a decentralized network. And so by virtue of the fact that this person has the key, demonstrates they have ownership of this did doc, and this did doc then points to the thing that's going to be of interest. As I mentioned before, having the secret key that corresponds to the public key is what uniquely defines the real person's control over the document. So already we're starting to see we have this digital representation as a did document and a real person, and it's the key pair that binds these two things together. So as long as the person retains the exclusive control of their key, then they have a provable digital proxy for their digital identity. In a practical sense, there's a simpler version of this called the Pairwise key exchange or Pairwise trust relationship. And in practice, these systems, real people won't necessarily post a did doc out on a public network, but corporations and institutions typically will. So when we talk about Pairwise trust relationships, it's a lighter weight way for a company or institution to have a relationship with a real person without having to post additional documents out on the public ledger, without the real person having to post documents out on the public ledger. And so you can see in this diagram, we have kind of a company and a school on the left-hand side and a real person on the right-hand side. So the company will have a public did document. They'll have their secret key and their private key and their public key corresponding to that. And the school will have the same. But then the relationship between the company and the real person will be this pairwise relationship, and the relationship between the school and the person will have a pairwise relationship. And that effectively allows them to have a secured communication between these two people. So PII is obviously a hot topic right now, and it's super important when we talk about decentralized IDs. Best practice dictates that we don't have PII out on any sort of public network. We don't share it, and there's a lot of good reason for that, right? It limits exposure to PII. It reduces a chance of unwanted release of personal information, and frankly, it decreases the attractiveness of stores of data for bad actors to manipulate. And so we remove this data. The question comes up to say, sure, it's safer, but if we remove the information, what good is it? Is it useful anymore? And that's where verifiable credentials come in. That's sort of the second half of the story when we're talking about trust and identity over the internet. It builds off of the identity, and it allows credentials, allows information to be efficiently shared between parties in a controlled manner, while making sure that the information is trustworthy from end to end. And I'll get to that a little more in a second. So more important terms to know. When we bring in the concept of verifiable credentials, we start to have this trifecta of actors here. We have what we call a credential issuer, which is what you might expect. This is someone who issues a credential about another entity, another party. We have the credential holder, and the credential holder is typically going to be the subject of the credential, but they don't have to be. So for example, I might have gone to a university and I want a credential saying that I graduated from that university. You would have, I would be the holder of that, and I'd also be the subject of that. And then finally, we have the concept of a credential verifier. And this is a party that would at some point receive a credential. So as a holder, I might present this credential to another party and say, here's something interesting about me, please believe it. Effectively, a verifiable credential is really nothing more than a formal declaration that some third party makes about you. The sort of the magic of the verifiable credential is that any sort of tampering with a credential is easily recognized. The identity of the issuer and the subject are easily confirmed. And probably the most important thing is that the verifier, that is the party that receives the credential, that wants to do something with it, wants to know some information, they never need to contact the issuer. And this is something I think that makes verifiable credentials somewhat unique in terms of presenting information. Typically, if you want to verify something, you have to go back to the institution. Like if somebody's applying for a job and an applicant claims they went to a particular school, the organization who is offering the job would need to go back to the school to make to verify that. I love this photo. So the big picture here, we call this the trust triangle. And what we see here again is the issuer, the holder, and the verifier. And in front of each of those real world entities, we have the digital identity of the issuer, the holder, and the verifier. And you see that the technology, works on the digital identities, and we establish these pairwise trust between them. And that represents these real world entities, and it's all anchored across the bottom with these DID documents on a public network. So it's a lot to unpack in this slide. I think it's a really nice way, nice visual of kind of seeing how the all the players in the credential space and what all the various pieces are in a very compact way. So we want to try and close this identity gap on the internet. We have this concept we call identity over IP. And really what identity over IP is all about is making humans a trusted part of digital interactions. So proving the trusted identity of the human initiating an interaction to the human receiving the interaction. So again, we see down the bottom these these two characters, and you have these computers kind of talking to one another, and they understand IP addresses and they understand button clicks and so forth, but they really don't have a sense of who's behind it. And that's really kind of what we're trying to accomplish by implementing this identity over IP. So getting a little deeper into the weeds of this, we have some more important terms to know. The first is a decentralized identifier. Next is a DID method and DID document. So we talked a little bit already about the decentralized identifier and the DID document. And the DID method is, well, I'll get to the details of that in the next slide. But basically, the DID method is sort of, it specifies a set of rules for how DID is registered, resolved, and updated, as well as sort of implying what it is that a DID can do. So if we look at the actual internals, over in the lower left-hand side of the screen at the bottom, we see what is actually a DID, and it's broken out into 3 separate sections. We call the scheme, which is literally just the letters DID colon. We have the method. In this case, it's the word example, and then we have some data that's associated with that. And what this does is it resolves to a document, the DID document, and this is literally just a text type of document stored on a public ledger. But you can see how these things start to relate. Within the document, we have the DID itself. So up top where you see the ID, you have a public key information. You can see in there you've got all kinds of information about the public key, the type of key it is, who the controller is, what the ID is, as well as the key data itself. And then down at the bottom, we have this section called service. And this is where you have these service endpoints. So when I get this DID document, the service endpoints basically tell me what I can do. So it can send me to a website, for example. It can send me to a process that does something on my behalf. It's a very sort of broad and generic kind of area that when I go out and I hit I resolve to this DID document, it allows me to do things. The verifiable credential is somewhat similar in that it's a document. Over on the right-hand side is kind of a sample of the document. But instead of being out there in the public ledger, this is something that is typically going to be stored by the issuer of a credential and potentially the holder and maybe like in their wallet that they carry around with them. So you can see we have all the various information. I've highlighted a few of these things in yellow. I'm not going to go through too much detail about it, but it basically talks about the identity of the issuer, identity of the subject, and it have additional detail about things like what information is contained in this credential. So is this a credential that relates to a some training I've had? Is it a credential that relates to a license that I might possess? It might even be a credential to specify a ticket to a concert or something. It can be all kinds of different things. And again, the credential itself is very flexible. You think about this as third party saying something about you or enabling something for you. This is a bit of an eye chart, but it's kind of a quick overview of the credential issuance process. So effectively what happens, let's say our subject and our holder on the right, and we've got our issuer and institution on the left, that the subject wants the institution to issue a credential to them. So the issuer would have a secret key and then a public key and a DID document on the public ledger. And down at the bottom, you see that this is the DID document for the institution, and they'll have public key information, they'll have the services in there and a bunch of other stuff. And then there's also out on the public ledger, and this is something we haven't talked about before, there'll be credential schemas. So you can think of these as templates for credentials. Again, one might be for, I've graduated from college, another might be I have a driver's license. There are all kinds of different credentials that are out there, but these will be sort of standardized, they'll be versioned and so forth. So the subject, calls the institution, says, hey, I'd like a credential. I graduated from your school, please give me this credential saying that I did that. So the institution will go out and generate this information. And on the left, you see the little credential icon. Within that credential, there'll be reference to the schema, who the issuer is, who the subject is, in this case, the person on the right, the school that they graduated from, and some additional information. They'll create that credential, they'll sign it, they'll store it perhaps, but the important part is they give a copy of it to the credential holder. So now the holder has everything they need to take this credential and hand it to a verifier. So they present the credential. In this case, we extend the scenario where the subject now wants to present this credential, let's say to a company that they are applying for a job at. And they literally will set up a pairwise communication between the subject holder and this verifier. So now they've got between the subject holder and the verifier, they've got a unique encrypted clear channel where they can communicate. So the verifier knows they're talking to the holder and nobody else, and the holder knows they're talking to the company and nobody else. Within that channel, the holder presents the credential to the company. The company can then open up that credential and look at all the information that's in there and fully convince themselves of its accuracy and its validity. They can check the schema, they can check the issuer, they can check the subject, they can check the school. And so they know, without ever having to contact the issuer, the legitimacy of this block of information that they've just received from the subject. And when you think about this, it's a simple concept, but it's a powerful one. That let's say the issuer goes out of business, or they close shop, or let's say, if we extend this to maybe, even a governmental situation, or in a sort of a less than reputable type of environment, where the issuer decides that they no longer want to make this claim that they had previously made about the subject. Well, today, if the issuer goes away and the verifier calls an issuer, it's entirely between the verifier and the issuer. If you take them out of the equation, now it's the subject who controls their own information. It's portable. They can take it anywhere. It's irrefutable, which is super powerful. So really what this is about is connecting people across the communication line, not just digital endpoints. So in the previous little animation, we had this thing where we have an IP address saying transfer my bank balance, and then a receiver saying, I understand the IP address, but who's asking? Now we can really start to talk about, well, who's asking? And if I make a claim about myself, the receiving party can say, well, that's interesting, but who says? And so now we can have the tools to really understand who is vouching for you. So that's all, good stuff. But how does this really survive out there in the real world? And this is something that is called trust over IP. And I think it was John Jordan from BC Gov who coined this term. I really like it. It really starts to frame up how this whole kind of concept of trust and identity and self-sovereign identity behaves in the real world. When we talk about trust over IP, there's really kind of three aspects of it. There's technology, there's reputation, and then there's recourse. And I'm going to go into each of these things in a little more detail. But it's all about this concept of governance by design. And if we, I'm just going to go ahead and build this whole stack here and go over it. So if we look at the trust over IP architectural stack, there are various layers. You can see on the left-hand side that these layers span the concepts of technology, reputation, and recourse. Down at the bottom, we have layer 0, which is effectively the internet. Now, one of the key points about this whole self-sovereign identity, and there's a lot of debate around this, is the methods in which these information is shared. It doesn't have to be over the internet. I mean, you can do this even on paper or with drums or whatever you want to do. But practically speaking, the growth of this and the adoption is going to be over the internet. So I put this down here as the foundational layer. It's all the stuff we're used to, TCP IPs, HTTPS, or certificates, all that stuff is in play. The layer 1 on top of that is where we start to introduce the concept of DID compatible networks and DID compatible methods. So these are the backbone ledgers. And if you remember back in the trust triangle, it's kind of the part on the bottom that all this is built upon, defines interoperability of traffic. The ledgers themselves, and I think this is really important, and I mentioned this earlier, can be public so that it sort of everybody in the world can have access to it, but they can also be domain constrained. They can be consortium-based, industry-based, government-based. And we sort of anticipate that there'll be a lot of these kinds of networks evolving. Some of them will be relatively small, and some of them will be very global in scope. The next layer up is we have the DID communication protocols. So these are the standards and code implementations that facilitate the communication and activity on behalf of these user agents, so the digital aspect, the digital representations of us. On top of that, we layer on the credential exchange. And this is, we're starting to get, more macro as we go up the stack. And this is about the definition of what does a verifiable credential look like? How do we verify it? What are the types of cryptography that we use and so forth? Top of that layer, we have the governance framework. And this is really all about the best practices regarding the operational roles, the contractual and legal templates. This is not to be minimized. This is a very important aspect to making these things work. And as these systems get larger and span, more industries, institutions, and frankly, goals and legal systems, having these governance structures in place, it becomes more and more important. If it's, if it's just, 3 people kind of having fun with this sort of thing, obviously the governance is something that can be, much smaller. But, as you start to expand, it becomes more important. And then finally, and this is something that not a lot of people are really talking about now, but it's super important, is this notion of having recourse built into all of these layers and having recourse at various points in the stack. Technology fails, people fail. And so you want to make sure that there's a way kind of outside of the system that allows you to solve and resolve types of problems. And I'll show what I mean a little more later. I want to expand the governance framework a little bit because you can see that there's sort of an overlay here that align to the technology layers. So kind of down at layer 1, where we're talking about compatible DID networks, there's a governance framework that specifies, things like, who can update the code and, how do these networks interoperate. Going up to the next layer around the DID communication protocols, we sort of have this concept of a provider governance framework. And you can think of this as sort of certifications and audit rules and things that would apply to providers of hardware and software, cloud agents, wallets, hosting providers, all sort of the bits and pieces that make up the data communication protocol. You kind of want to make sure that you're dealing with with reputable organizations that have the proper levels of certification, that have proper levels of auditability, and so on. Above that, when we start talking about credential exchange, similar kind of thing. You want to make sure that there's governance around issuing and revoking credentials. Interestingly, we might even be getting into things like specifying certain business models or even liability frameworks. So, for example, if I issue a credential and I do that in good faith, and somebody uses that and that proves to be wrong and causes harm, how do we handle those things? There are sort of legal, even sort of liability frameworks that come into play. And then finally, we have kind of a meta system governance framework concept that sort of kind of the top level governing the overall policies for everything that kind of fits together. So all fun stuff. One of the ways we look at this is say, for each of those layers, for each of those sort of major components, the technology and so forth. So the technology, the reputation, the recourse. What aspect of trust is afforded by these segments? So if we look at kind of just the technology portion, it does a lot of stuff for us. It allows that each party in a conversation can trust that the other party is who they claim to be and no one else. That's huge. We could stop there and this would be well worth the price of admission. But then the credential verifier can trust that the subject of the credential and the person claiming to be the subject are one and the same. So I can't take my friend's credential from Stanford and claim that it's mine if I didn't actually go there. A verifier of a credential can trust that the credential that's presented to them by the holder hasn't been modified by the holder or any intermediary. So when a verifier receives a credential, they know that it has been unaltered from the moment that it was issued. So hugely important. And again, all this without having to contact the issuer themselves. The technology also ensures that the architecture itself is reputable, so fault tolerant, resistant to centralized control. There's awful lot in the news today about the woes of having data controlled by for-profit entities or perhaps governments that have agendas that go counter to individuals. This is really more of a social question, even though it really is driven by technology. The fact that it's decentralized, fault tolerant, and so forth, just simply makes it a lot more difficult for single organizations to claim authority and then start setting the rules that might go against the wishes of others who participate in the ecosystem. So reputation is kind of the next part of the trust over IP concept. And here, we look in terms of, I can receive information using the technology and I can be assured of its integrity, but what does that really mean to me as a verifier? And what the verifiable credentials do, along with the decentralized ID, it allows a verifier to evaluate the reputation and the trustworthiness of an issuer. So if I'm a verifier and I receive two credentials and I get one from Acme Educational Company and I get one from again using Stanford, each of those entities have a reputation both online and in the real world that I as the verifier can look at and go, well, I know Stanford, I don't know Acme, and you can start to put some valuation on that. That goes into sort of the next layer, which is the actual claims that are made in this verifiable claim. If I as a verifier receive two credentials, one, let's say, from the state Department of Motor Vehicles saying that person A has the right to drive, and I receive another credential from some guy named Cousin Vinny who says person A has the right to drive. they're both, legitimate credentials, and I both trust the fact that they've been unadulterated and I received them correctly from the right person. But the claims that are made within that credential, I now have a framework with which to evaluate. Obviously, I'm going to look at, what the Department of Motor Vehicles says about, license to driving rather than this guy named Vinny. The reputation also ensures the ecosystem itself is operated fairly and by trustworthy actors. And again, this ties very much into the governance, certification, and so forth. The fact that there are organizations and institutions and individuals that are willing to support these concepts, open themselves up to auditing and so on, builds that trust that that everybody is operating in good faith. And then finally, that the software and hardware are developed in accordance with standards and meet certain levels of criteria for like interoperability, for security, for patching, and all these kinds of things. And finally, you look at sort of the trust that's afforded by Recourse. And it sounds a little odd, what do you mean trust by Recourse? Because Recourse is typically thought of as sort of the last backstop for resolving issues. But throughout the whole ecosystem, you have to have methods of resolving disagreements and breaches of contract. And these can be all levels. These can be recourse at operational levels. This can be recourse dealing with agreed upon arbitration. And finally, when all else fails, you want to have a legal system that you can kind of take these things to. And that seems kind of obvious, especially for folks living in in the EU or the US, Canada, and so forth. But in a lot of other countries where you may not have a really robust legal system, and you have issues, what do you do? And so it's not saying that you can't run these kinds of systems effectively in areas without strong legal systems, but it's something that needs to be considered. It's just inherent complexity when you're talking about multi-party, multi-jurisdictional ecosystems. So we can agree to things when we set things up, but through circumstances, disagreements arise, problems arise, and these can be driven by lots of things. They can be bad actors, they can be just poor performers, they can be accidental. So you want to have some way of providing recourse outside of this to make sure that you can maintain the integrity of the ecosystem, and that not one, it's just one bad actor isn't going to bring the whole thing down effectively. Okay, so I'm going to gloss over a lot of this network of ecosystems, but the concept here is that, again, I mentioned earlier that these ecosystems, these networks, we anticipate them developing for various reasons and at various sizes. You might have something that a government implements, you might have something that an industry implements, or maybe even cross-industry that's around specific kinds of consortium. So the idea is, you want to be able to have these systems to interoperate, and we have these concepts of a peer net and a metasystem network and a decentralized namespace registry. And again, I'm not, for this particular talk, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but just get the sense that as this whole set of technology and these concepts around trust and identity evolve, you're going to want to connect these things together. And so we've got some of these early concepts of levels of compliance and certification, and and go into that in a future discussion. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about some use cases, and these are typically going to be kind of the archetype use cases a lot of people talk about. They're in no way comprehensive, but it starts to illustrate some of the ways people are thinking about it. And kind of another way to say that is these are probably going to be the early adopting or early adopted scenarios, low-hanging fruit, however you want to describe that. But they do a good job of kind of getting a feel for where this might fit into a particular business or industry. And in the first scenario is around a job application. So we talked a little bit about the mechanisms of the credential and so forth, but I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of trust across this scenario, because I think that's super important. And the setup is we have Alice and Faber University, where Alice went to school, and we have Acme Industries, where now that Alice has graduated, she wants to apply for a job. Alice has these pairwise trusts between herself and the university, and pairwise trust between herself and Acme. Now, the trust that she has between herself and the university is actually pretty strong. She's been going to that university for 4 years. She's been there in person. They know her. They've built up trust through their interactions. So when Alice goes back to Faber and says, "Hey, would you please issue me a credential?" Faber says, "Sure. We know who you are. We know who you are digitally because we have the pairwise trust, so we don't have to question that. And so, absolutely, we're happy to present you with a credential." Now, when Alice goes to Acme Industries and applies for a job, she self-attests to Acme to say, "Hi, my name is Alice and I graduated from Faber." And they go, "Well, okay, sure, we'll trust, but we need to verify, right?" So Acme doesn't have a very high level of trust because they haven't really interacted with Alice. And so they might go to Alice and say, "Well, is there anybody who can vouch for you?" And Alice says, "Sure, I've got Faber University." Now, you know Faber. And Acme says, "Well, of course we know Faber. We hire a lot of people from Faber, and they're a great institution. We've had a lot of experience hiring people, and they've done very well for our company. So we trust their reputation." So Alice says, "Great." Hands Acme the verifiable credential. Acme is able to authenticate it. They're able to confirm that it did come from Faber. It is about Alice. They have the information they need, that she graduated, and they trust Faber. So now Acme has more trust in Alice, and they might ask her for additional credentials from different institutions. And so Acme over time starts building more and more of a trust relationship with Alice. Obviously, when Alice starts working for Acme, there's a different kind of internal trust that's being built there. But the key takeaway here is that this is, it evolves over time, and by using verifiable credentials, it allows you to kind of jumpstart that trust cycle. Another example that's commonly talked about is our online banking accounts. And again, it's the same sort of thing. Alice wants to set up an account at Acme, and Acme, for purposes of this discussion, is an online-only bank. So they don't have the opportunity to see Alice in person. They need to, but somehow they need to kind of jumpstart this. How do they do this? So Alice contacts the Acme bank and makes some statements about herself. "My name is Alice." They say, "Okay, well, we'll trust you for now that your name is Alice, but we need a bunch of information from you to help confirm that." So they ask for credentials, and maybe it's for a credit card. They might ask for information about a different bank account, whatever it is that Acme Bank needs to feel that Alice is who she says she is, and that Alice is going to be a trustworthy customer for them. So Alice can present all this information. The online bank, who has never met Alice, can build their level of trust to the level necessary to allow Alice to be a customer. And so they do, and Alice transfers money in, and that builds more trust between Alice and Acme. And then you can think about scenarios later where maybe Alice comes back and says, "Great, I've been banking here for a while, now I would like to borrow money," for example. And so Acme might ask for additional credentials, which Alice can provide, which then again increases the amount of trust between Acme and Alice. And over time, if Alice pays off the loan, trust builds. If she doesn't, trust declines. And it's this, this evolutionary kind of almost organic interaction that is underpinned by the fact that Acme and Alice never have to question whether they're communicating with the right individual. So that's super important. And they never have to question the validity of the credentials that are being presented. They have to evaluate whether they're important or not, but they don't have to, but they're assured that what they receive is in fact what was issued by a third party. Pairwise Federation, this is kind of an answer to the federated logins. In this particular scenario, Alice really likes the idea of using, like her Facebook or Google account to log in, so she doesn't have to have all kinds of different IDs and passwords. But she would kind of prefer that she wouldn't have to rely on, a large corporation to maintain that information. So here's where the Pairwise connections really come into play in a very powerful way. Alice can go out and set up these Pairwise connections between each of these website accounts, for example. And it's a very quick and easy thing. It's a lightweight thing to do. We don't have to have, Alice doesn't have to have, did documents out on the ledger and so forth. These are things that can be done kind of point to point. Keys are easy to generate. The technology is such that keys are still a little difficult for individuals to manage. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting user experience work that's going on right now that'll make it so that it just becomes sort of part of the natural fabric of society of managing these keys. But right now, it's still a little challenging. But if you can sort of suspend that for a little bit, you imagine Alice going out and creating these pairwise relationships with all these different entities. So now when she goes back to them, there's no password, there's no ID. She just simply presents herself with a key, and the corresponding site recognizes that and says, oh, hey, Alice, welcome back. The idea of not having to have IDs and passwords for every single web property out there and not having to rotate passwords and change them is huge. And, best practice dictates that you rotate your keys periodically, but that can be done in an automated fashion, can be done in a way that really makes sense. It also is a great way of limiting fallout. So if there are some breaches somewhere, if somehow they happen to get the information, it's limited to one communication channel. It doesn't explode all of your communication channels, and it certainly doesn't explode the communication channels between individual users. So it's very isolated. Bad things will happen. There are bad actors out there, but it's very difficult to do at the scale that is being done today. There's also some other interesting concepts of using decentralized IDs to integrate with corporate identity and access management. And there, again, some really interesting work that's being done at BC Gov around this, where effectively you can use these same concepts of pairwise trust, employee credentials, DIDs and DID documents to interact with existing IAM systems, so that now in this particular scenario, Alice, who is the employee of Acme, can have an employee badge. They can have keys on their phone. There are many different ways that Alice can access corporate resources in a global fashion very easily without having to deal with passwords every 90 days and all the kinds of things that normally go on. And from the corporate side, because they're using these these pairwise keys, they know that any time that this is being accessed, anytime their resources are being accessed, as long as Alice can maintain the integrity of her keys, they know it's Alice and nobody else. So it's sort of a win-win on both sides. And it's really an exciting use case that's emerging. So that's kind of the end of the presentation. I was asked if I present a book that inspired me, and this is one that I came up with, Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technology. It's an older one, and even though this talks about self-sovereign identity, this particular book is really what kind of set me on the path. It really opened up my eyes to the kind of technologies that were in play, the ways of implementing blockchains and Merkle trees, and how cryptography fits into this whole scheme of things. And so without this book, it wouldn't have led me to some of the industry use cases that I worked on in my career, and it wouldn't have led me into the decentralized identity and the verifiable credentials, which really I think is the core to a lot of these use cases that I was struggling with trying to solve in my day job. So with that, thank you, and any questions, be happy to attempt to answer some.
Absolutely, that's great, Steve. Thank you so much. By the way, I did read this book when it came out. I gave them, initially they published it on on the internet, and I think it was in 2014, I think.
Yeah, PDF.
So, and yeah, I think it's the best book about Bitcoin too, because it's the most technical and deepest about thinking about architecture. Yeah. We have a question here from James. He's just saying, Steve, thank you so much. Awesome talk. Do you have a reference to setting up a DDNR registry method for a company?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
He was asking, thank you for the talk. Do you have a reference to setting up a DDNR registry method for a company?
Here, this is probably the easiest way. This is where you should go. Just start looking around there. You'll find lots of good information. I don't have a specific link to send you to right now.
Okay. Mario, I see that you're raising your hand. If you can, please use the question tool. If you just, depending on your language, you should see it there. And just jump in now there, and there you can share the question, okay? Another question coming in here from Leah. She's asking, can you share some of the organizations, individuals who are working on the UX for private key management?
I wish that I could. To be perfectly honest, this is some conversations that came up at the last IAW. And I know that there are some groups that are starting to form around that. And in particular, I think they're taking a really good approach. They're talking about various paradigms of interaction. So for example, we think of something like email, back before email was email, people would say things like, well, if I download my email, then how can I get it on another computer? Because they were thinking in terms of, the analog, a postman comes and hands you something, right? But, we got used to the paradigm, and now we have this sort of this mental model of how it works, and, we're very comfortable with it. So I think, the work that's being done, there's a lot of people, thinking about these same sorts of things. If I've got, I'm just picking a number, 3,000, keys that I need to manage, how do I manage that? What's the mental model that I deal with that? Because it certainly can't be, 3,000, individual little things that I have to manage. So probably check, some of the notes at IAW. I think there will be a list of individuals who are, really focused on kind of the user experience of this.
Yeah, and I fully agree with Steve that, this is one of the bigger subjects, and I really like the fact that you brought up this book about Bitcoin from Arvind Narayanan. He's a Princeton cryptographer researcher, and I think this is basically, the cryptocurrency space really brought this up, and the blockchain space about making it a big subject about managing your own keys, and it is a huge subject now for identity too, because it's even worse to more than losing $1 million. It's even worse if you lose your identity, or you cannot recover your identity. So it's a big subject. And there's a report that's called Decentralized Key Management Systems, and we also have a webinar that we did and that covers the subject. That I recommend you to check out. It was commissioned by the Homeland Security Agency in the United States, and you can just find it online. If not, just ping me in the Telegram group of SSI Meetup, and I can also send you a link. Another question here from Mario. Mario is asking, will this webinar be uploaded to see it again? Yes, it will be uploaded in the coming hour, and you will have the slide deck from Steve and the video recording and the slideshare deck also. Mary is also asking, what about behavioral biometric as a trusted ID? What do you think, Steve?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. I don't know. I think it's important, and they will converge, because when we're talking about trust, especially when we talk about reputation, it becomes this very sort of squishy human thing. I might trust you, in a certain context, but not trust you in a different context. And so we start to, bring in these outside concepts of, how do we quantify trust? I don't know that we can ever really absolutely quantify it, but we can, get some sort of framework with which to evaluate. So I think it's a really interesting area.
Yeah. And we're also planning to do a specific SSI meetup about the subject because it's quite controversial. Some people have very strong views that biometric information shouldn't be used in the identity space for privacy reasons, for security reasons. So it's very controversial. So yeah, I'm taking a note also to try to cover the subject in the future so that we have a deeper thinking on the subject because it comes up quite regularly. Steve, I have 3 more questions, and if anyone wants to jump in, please feel free to share your questions. As you've been, because you've been like in the space now like for a year or more, and I've noticed this with many people in the technology space, even though if you have you can have a very strong technical background and from an architecture or programming point of view or whatever, and still people struggle a lot in understanding how the SSI ecosystem architecture is set up and how it works and how it's useful. What is it that you struggled with the most, and what helped you to understand those things that you struggled with the most?
Oh, that's a super good question. That list is long. You know, I think I would explain it like this. So using it as an analogy, I spent a lot of time, building, data systems, and a lot of that were relational type data systems. And then as things sort of start to emerge, I would have these conversations and say, the problem space that the industry and companies are trying to solve these days tend to be different than we're trying to solve before. In data systems, it used to be, well, we need to know, how many widgets we sold, or how much commission we paid, or whatever it is, and it had to be very precise and double-footed and accounting and all and so forth. I say, now when you go out to Google and you do a Google search, well, that's a query on a database, right? So how accurate and precise is that? And the answer is, well, you're asking the wrong question. The question that you're asking is, how valuable is the result to me? And so, I see some of this going on with when we're talking about things like trust, we can't be asking the question, well, what's your trust number? I mean, we will set frameworks around that, but it's a different kind of question. How reliable is this information? Do I believe what you are saying? These are all kinds of problem spaces that have become so pervasive that we just don't even see them anymore. They're just sort of part of the background. And I think these tools that are emerging are starting to, for lack of a better way of describing it, kind of shining a light on some of these things that were always there that we just sort of didn't recognize before because we couldn't do anything about. And now we can do something about that. And that's sort of, I think, sort of the big aha moment I had, was just sort of recognizing that here is this kind of brand new problem space that can greatly reduce fraud. It can, greatly increase trust. It can bring sort of a human element into, a digital ecosystem, to all these, great and wonderful things, if we start looking at it as the problem that it really is. So that's a little bit of woo-woo and a little long way of doing it, but that's kind of my answer.
Okay, and what would you recommend to CIO who's interested in this, who wants to start learning about it, or who wants to even maybe start playing around with it at his organization? How would you recommend someone in that position how should he or she get started?
Yeah, so there are a number of really great organizations out there and consultants out there, and people willing to talk about these kinds of things. So having briefings, talking about what this what identity and trust sort of means and how that relates to their particular business is really important, because at the end of the day, these are great and interesting things, and can kind of help change the flow of society and benefit mankind and so forth. But to get projects done, you need to have some relationship to the business of the organization. And so being able to talk to people who understand this concept and understand how this fits in is really the best way. And of course, then from there goes to, let's find some pilot projects to work on, look at, are you getting the benefits that you need, and expand and so forth. It becomes, pretty straightforward from that point on.
Wonderful. I have a final question here from Mario. I'm not sure I understand it. Maybe you help me if you do. Or he's adding some more context here. So is psycholinguistics a way to build up psychological profiling as part of a trustable ID? Is that possible? And then he's adding through text. I mean, when a person writes text, you can use machine learning, inaugural chat with the bot text, maybe analyzed. That's what I got.
Yeah, and I think I understand the question, and I'll answer it in a somewhat obtuse way. You know, we go back to the sort of the trust over IP slide when we talked about technology, reputation, and recourse. So the technology is really kind of what, and I'm air quoting here, we have been focused on mostly. It's, you know, getting the plumbing to work, making sure that the protocols are there, the cryptography works, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, what the technology is allowing us to do is have a secure channel of communication, and that I know that who I'm talking to is who I'm supposed to be talking to, and that the information is getting across, you know, properly. That tells me nothing about the value of that information. I could have, you know, a extremely unreputable, you know, individual, you know, feeding me just nothing but garbage. You know, the old adage of data in or garbage in, garbage out. There's really sort of this concept of, you know, trust in, trust out. And so when you're talking about what is the quality or the trustworthiness of that information, that's where you get into the reputation. I think that's where, you know, sort of the psycholinguistics start to come into play, is how do you evaluate that? How do you evaluate the message, you know, in the context of your communication? Is, you know, can I trust this? Can I rely on it? You know, and obviously the use cases vary all over the place. If you're talking about, you know, IoT that's sending off data, it's going to be very different from, you know, having an interaction with, you know, potentially, you know, let's say, you know, political, you know, discourse. You know, very different kinds of problem spaces.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. I think we covered all the questions. Any final thoughts, anything you would like to share with this audience and also with the video audience that will be watching and listening to this in the future?
I just think this is really a super exciting space, and it's got, you know, a lot of profound implications for industry and society, and I'm, you know, super happy to do my part in kind of helping promote it.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. Thank you for being part of this community too. I've been part of it now for 3 years, and it has been growing like crazy, and I think we'll keep on growing much more. For everyone else, we will have a wonderful DID marathon on the 4th of February with Drummond Reed and Marcus Sabadello. We will have a first session, depending on your time zone. Let's keep it open, but are 2 different sessions. Basically, the first one will be about the DID working group from the W3C face-to-face meeting that is taking place this week in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And Drummond and Marcus will be updating us about all the things that happened there in terms of the DID working group. So that's always cool. And we already had our first recording of that feedback session from session they had in Japan. And this is the second one from the very recently created DID working group. And following that, like an hour later after that session, we have a DID deep dive, and this is part of the first session we are recording for the self-sovereign identity book that we're publishing this summer or later this year with Manning, which is called Self-Sovereign Identity, where Drummond and myself are the co-authors, and we have many people collaborating on this book. Drummond and Marcus have written an amazing chapter to explain in a really understandable way what DIDs are about, and we will use this webinar to present a chapter, to present all those ideas, and and it will basically be the reference recording for that chapter of the book. We will be doing recordings for all the chapters of the book. So this is the first one, and you will be hearing more about this book as we go, which we hope and believe will become the reference book about identity and SSI in the coming years, because we really have gathered some of the best minds in the space. If you want to listen to this recording or just check out the slides, I'll be publishing them very soon, in the next hours or maybe tomorrow. And just go to the same page where you check this out at SSI Meetup, and you will be able to download it there. upcoming sessions and everything. As always, please join the Telegram group, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all those social media channels, and where we inform you about all that. The place where we inform always the first time and the quickest is in the Telegram group. You have the link in the bottom of the website of SSI Meetup that you can check out, and there are also discussions happening about the whole SSI space. And I think that covers everything. And Steve, thank you so much for making time, and I hope to meet you also personally in the future. And when you want to talk more about your progress and your learnings in the SSI space, it would be really great to have you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.